Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into this video. It's Miss Saul, Head of English at King Alfred's Academy, and today I'm going to be talking you through how to write analytically about a poem. So how to write analytically about what a poet is showing us, in particular in relation to a theme that that poem is exploring, is quite straightforward if you follow certain ingredients. So if you include and start with a statement in which you are laying out clearly to the reader of your analysis what you're going to prove the poet is showing and exploring in relation to the theme in the poem. Followed by some evidence in the form of a quotation, which clearly shows the reader of your analysis which phrase in the poem has helped you to work out the thing that the poet is showing us, which has led you to make the statement that you've made. And then finally, the last part of the foundation to a good written analysis is the inference. So what has this helped you to show the reader of your analysis? Well, it enables you to actually explain to them what exactly has been hinted at and suggested through the imagery, through the ideas that are being presented in your quote, in the phrases that you've quoted, and how this has therefore led you to conclude and make the statement that you've given at the start of your analysis. So these are the foundations, and this is what I'm going to talk you through today about how to do this really successfully. We're all somewhat familiar with SQI, possibly as part of SQI CED, squiced paragraphs. Today we're just going to focus in on perfecting the SQI part, and that is the aim really of this week's learning. What are we hoping to achieve by the end of this week's video? So by the end of this video, you will have written at least the foundations of an analytical paragraph about the poem Remains by Simon Armitage. So if you remember, that is a poem that I set for you to revise and to look at a couple of weeks ago, or your teacher. And then we're also going to have a go at writing the foundations of an analytical paragraph about the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen. And that is also a poem that you were set a couple of weeks ago to look at. So obviously, in order to be successful at this week's learning, we do need to have already watched and made the videos and made notes on the poem about called Remains and the poem called Exposure. So if you haven't yet had a chance to do that for whatever reason, please do go back on your Show My Homework and follow the links to watch those videos and make notes on the key quotes from those poems before continuing on with this, because you'll need those for this week. You'll also need your notes on those quotes in front of you for this lesson. By the end of this week, we're going to be asking you to submit some written work, these foundational analytical paragraphs, on to Show My Homework, so your teacher can actually have a look at them and provide you some feedback. So it's really, really important that you have those notes in front of you to help you be as successful as possible in this activity before submitting it to your teacher. Okay, so how to write a successful statement. So, as I said, statement is the first part of a written analysis. It's really, really important. And basically what a statement is a clear and straightforward claim to show you have understood one particular thing the poet's showing about the theme explored in the poem. So whatever you claim in this statement, that's what the rest of your analysis in this paragraph is going to go on to prove. So everything else that you say has to be proving and explaining how you reach this statement. So I'm going to model one with you now. I'm going to look at the poem Remains by Armitage, and the theme I've chosen to explore is the effective conflict. In his poem Remains, Armitage suggests that war leads to the desensitization of soldiers. Just a reminder, the word desensitization means when someone is less likely to feel shock or distressed at scenes of cruelty or suffering because they've been so exposed to it for so long that it all becomes quite normal and they no longer react in the way you would expect. Okay, so this is my statement. I am clearly claiming that Armitage is suggesting one thing about the effect of war. Okay, so how did I do this? Well, firstly, I clearly named the poem I'm going to talk about so that there can be no doubt in my reader's mind which poem I am looking at. I then clearly name the poet that wrote the poem, showing my knowledge of the poem and who wrote it. And then finally, to finish my statement, I make one clear claim regarding what the poet is suggesting in relation to the theme the poet is exploring. So in this case, I've said that he's saying the effect of conflict is that war leads to the desensitization of soldiers. Okay, so there's sort of 3 steps to making my statement. So the most important thing once you've written a statement like this is to read it all the way through and just remember that it does make sense. Check it does make sense as a whole sentence. So in his poem Remains, Armitage suggests that war leads to the desensitization of soldiers. Perfect, great. Okay, so we're now going to do one together. I'm going to do it step by step so you can see how I've come up with it. So firstly then, I need to clearly name the poem I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be writing about. Well, clearly I'm going to still stick with Remains for now, so that doesn't really change. In his poem, Remains, then I'm going to clearly name the poet that wrote the poem. So that's quite straightforward, it's Armitage. Finally, I'm going to make one clear claim regarding what the poem is suggesting in relation to the theme it's exploring. So I'm going to make a new claim this time. I'm going to suggest that Armitage is showing that death becomes normalised, meaning to make something seem like it's a normal everyday thing to see or experience, and trivialised during times of war. Trivialised meaning to make something seem less important or significant than it really is. Okay, so here's another claim I could make and then go on to prove about what Armitage is showing through his poem Remains. So this is how to build a really successful statement. Now I'm going to check it and make sure it makes sense. So in his poem Remains, Armitage suggests that death becomes normalised and trivialised during times of war. Yep, grammatically that really does make sense. So move on. So this is your turn to have a go. Okay, I'm going to ask you now to have a go at writing a clear statement, still about Remains, following these 1, 2, 3 steps to make your statement. So I'm going to suggest you pause the video here now and have a go. I've got some top tips down the bottom in case you're struggling to think of what to say. So thinking about the other things that Armitage might be showing about the effects of conflict and war, and I've given you a couple there to think about. So pause for a minute, pen and paper to hand, and have a go at building your statement. Feel free to rewind slightly to have a look at mine again if that will be helpful. Okay, so hopefully we've got our statement done. We know one clear thing that we could claim Armitage is showing us through his poem Remains about the effect of conflict. So now we're going to look at how to write a successful quotation, how to provide that evidence to show, we've got this idea from the poem itself. Here's the line, the phrase that has suggested this to us. So quotations are a phrase or group of words and phrases from the poem that helped you to work out one thing that the poet is showing that has led you to make the statement you've just written. Okay, so this needs to be embedded into a full sentence. You can't just plonk the quote down on the page. And for a really good one, you need to really explain when in the poem it was said and the context it was said in. So what was happening in the poem at the time, for instance, what else was going on. So I'm still sticking with Remains. I'm still going with the effect of conflict. So this is my model quote, if you like. So this is implied. So I'm talking about how soldiers have become desensitized. And this is implied when he describes how a soldier casually tosses the guts back into a dead man's body after he repeatedly shot him. Okay, so I've provided quotes directly from the poem to prove that the soldiers are becoming desensitized because their actions show me that. Okay, so how I've done this, I start with a clear sentence stem to show that I'm going to provide evidence now. Okay, so this is implied when, okay, or this is suggested when. I then go on to provide the quote, which I embed, I put into my sentence as part of my sentence. And I've remembered to include my quotation marks so you know exactly which words and phrases from my sentence are actually in the poem itself. Okay. And then finally, I've explained what has happened just before the soldier did this, or at the same time or just after. So in this case, I've just explained just before. He's just shot him and now he's doing this to the dead body, so that you can understand how and why the quote supports the claim that we've made in our statement. So I'm giving the context, if you like. Well, why has he done this? What's happened just before it? Okay, this is quite shocking. All right. So that's my model. I'm now going to go through building one with you as well. I need to check it. Don't forget to check it. So this is implied when he describes how a soldier casually tosses the guts back into a dead man's body after he repeatedly shot him. Excellent. Okay, makes sense. So I've got my statement that we built last time in the poem Remains. Armitage suggests that death becomes normalised and trivialised during times of war. So I now need to build my quotation to support this claim. So first I'm going to start with a clear sentence stem. Either this is implied or this is suggested when. So this is implied when. Nothing really different there. Okay. Next, I'm then going to go on to provide the quote that I think best proves that death becomes normalised and trivialised. So I'm going to embed that into my sentence, remembering my quotation marks. So he starts the poem quite conversationally with the phrase "on another occasion." Okay, it's quite chatty. So this is implying that it's all become quite normal and trivial to the soldiers. And then finally, I'm going to explain what has happened just before or at the same time or just after to fully show I've understood why the quote is going to support the statement that I've given. So in this case, he starts the poem quite conversationally with the phrase "on another occasion" before going on to tell the story of a man being shot dead. Okay, well, that's quite shocking. That's not normally considered quite easy conversation, and yet that's how it's introduced to us. So just checking that it all makes sense. This is implied when he starts the poem quite conversationally with the phrase "on another occasion" before going on to tell the story of a man being shot. Excellent. Okay, so I've got my 3 sections to my quotation. So it's over to you again. It's your turn. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video to have a go. And I want you to look at the statement you wrote earlier on when I asked you to pause the video last time. And I want you to now have a go at writing a sentence in which you provide a quotation as evidence to support the statement you wrote earlier. Now, again, at the bottom, I've given you some top tips. This time, I've given you some key quotes that were in the video that you looked at a couple of weeks ago. That you might want to use to prove the statement that you've given. Okay, so depending on what statement you've given, think about which quote might help to support and prove that. What quote could you use as evidence? So I'm going to ask you to pause the video now and have a go. Okay, brilliant. Wow. So hopefully by now we've got a statement and a quote to prove one thing that Armitage is showing through his poem Remains about the theme of the effect of conflict. So the last bit then is how to write a successful inference. So what is an inference? Well, it's an explanation of what has been suggested or hinted at through the images, the pictures, and the ideas that are being presented to us in the quotes, in the phrases you have selected, and then you explain how and why that imagery, those ideas, does in fact lead you to make the conclusion that you've reached in the statement you've given. So whatever you've claimed at the start of your paragraph, this is where you explain how the quote leads you to that claim. Okay, so I'm sticking with Remains. This is my inference. Okay, so this creates an image of a soldier carelessly handling the corpse. So this is him tossing the guts back into his body. So carelessly handling the corpse of the man he shot like it was rubbish to be thrown aside, not reacting to the graphic gore and violence of the situation. Armitage is therefore demonstrating that through exposure to constant violence and suffering, soldiers no longer have what would be considered normal reactions to such scenes, for they have become desensitized. Okay, So they don't feel the same emotional reaction that we would normally have. So how have I built this up? Well, firstly, I start by explaining the image that the quotation I've just provided gives me in my head. What picture do I have in my mind when I read that line? So this creates an image of a soldier carelessly handling the corpse of a man he shot, okay? That's the picture I have in my head when I think of him tossing the guts back into his body. I then explain what this is hinting at or suggesting, what's being implied here, that has helped me to get to the point where I can make a claim about what Armitage is trying to show. So the claim I've made in my statement. So he was handling the corpse of the man he shot like it was rubbish to be thrown aside. You know, by tossing it around, it's not respectful. So he's not reacting to the graphic gore and violence of the situation. He's treating it like any old bit of rubbish. Okay. And then finally, what I'm then going to go on to do is explain what it is that the poet is demonstrating about a particular effect of war. So what is Armitage trying to show us here? And how is he showing this to us, linking it back to my statement? So I've said Armitage is therefore demonstrating that through exposure to constant violence and suffering, like the dead man on the street, soldiers no longer have what would be considered normal reactions to such scenes, for they have become desensitized. Okay, so I've linked it back to the claim I first made in my statement. All right, so that's SQI. So, and I've checked it through, we've read it a couple of times just to make sure it makes sense. Always read through it again, okay, to make sure it does all make sense as a complete piece of writing. So let's now build one together. We've got our statement that we built earlier. We've got our quote that we then provided. So in his poem Remains, Armitage suggests that death becomes normalised and trivialised during times of war. This is implied when he starts the poem quite conversationally with the phrase "on another occasion" before going on to tell the story of a man being shot dead. So we're now going to say, firstly, start by explaining the image. What are you picturing in your mind when you read the quote "on another occasion"? So this creates an image of a soldier casually talking about one of many similar stories. On another occasion, there are many occasions like this, okay? So that's what I picture, this chatty soldier quite happily, casually talking about it. Then I'm going to explain what this hints at or suggests, okay? And how this is sort of helping me to get to the claim I've made in my statement. Remembering that I've said death has become normalized and trivialized. So this suggests he found himself in lots of different occasions in which people were graphically killed suddenly, and that these kinds of experiences often happened. On another occasion, suggesting that there were many of them. So they no longer seem to be very shocking to the soldier. This is why he speaks in a conversational and almost chatty tone, because it had become an everyday occurrence and a general topic of conversation. No longer something that you would shy away from talking about because it happens all the time. Okay, so that is my next step. My final step then is to explain what it is that the poet is therefore trying to demonstrate about the effect of war, and how is he showing this, linking it back to my statement that deaths become normalized and trivialized. So Armitage is therefore demonstrating that witnessing death becomes normal to soldiers during times of war, and its significance is gradually diminished, which means sort of shrunk and made smaller, until it becomes trivial, not important. Okay, so that's what Armitage is trying to show us, is that actually they no longer think that death is a significant thing because it happens so often. All right, so that's how I've built my inference step by step to support my statement by explaining what I can read into the quote I've provided. Okay, so you can see what's coming next. We need to proofread it. So this creates an image of a soldier casually talking about one of many similar stories. This suggests he found himself in lots of different occasions in which people were graphically killed suddenly, and that these kinds of experiences often happened, so they no longer seem to be very shocking to the soldier. This is why he speaks in a conversational and almost chatty tone, because it had become an everyday occurrence and general topic of conversation. Armitage is therefore demonstrating that witnessing death becomes normal to soldiers during times of war, and its significance is gradually diminished until it becomes trivial. Perfect. Makes sense. Just checking. Okay, so you can see what else. Okay, guys, so as you can see, we're going to have a go at doing one yourself. You're going to write a sentence or possibly a couple, as mine was, in which you explain the inferences you've made from the quote you provided earlier in your example, which was then used to support and as evidence of the statement you made near the beginning of the video, all about remains. Okay, so you'll need your statement and your quote that you wrote earlier. I've given you some top tips. You're going to follow these 3 steps just as I did. And top tips to think about. So what the quotes make you picture in your head. So if you think about you're picturing the soldier doing a certain thing or behaving in a certain way or feeling a certain way, depending on the quote you've chosen, what do you actually picture that soldier doing or feeling? And what does this make you think about the soldier? If you saw him in real life, feeling that way or behaving in that way, what conclusions would you reach? How would you feel about that soldier? Or what would you conclude about what is happening to that soldier? And then what does this make you think the poet's trying to show us about the effects that war has on soldiers? Okay, so I jot down some notes about those things first before you try and write your inference in full. It'd be a lot easier to have those notes in front of you before you start to write in full sentences. So pause and have a go. Okay, remember, once you have done this, reread to check it makes sense. Golden rule. And then, how does this create a successful foundation for an analytical paragraph? You have one now. You have brought together the different parts of SQI to help you create the good foundations of an analytical paragraph, analysing this poem, okay? So mine, brought together, looks like this. In his poem Remains, Armitage suggests that war leads to the desensitization of soldiers. This is implied when he describes how a soldier casually tosses the guts back into a dead man's body after he repeatedly shot him. This creates an image of a soldier carelessly handling the corpse of the man he shot, like it was rubbish to be thrown aside, not reacting to the graphic gore and violence of the situation. Armitage is therefore demonstrating that, through exposure to constant violence and suffering, soldiers no longer have what would be considered normal reactions to such scenes, for they have become desensitized. Okay, so that's me putting my statement, my quote, and my inference together, and then I've got this nice analytical paragraph forming. My second one that I did when I was modelling step by step reads, in his poem Remains, Armitage suggests that death becomes normalised and trivialised during times of war. This is implied when he starts the poem quite conversationally with the phrase, on another occasion, before going on to tell the story of a man being shot dead. This creates an image of a soldier casually talking about one of many similar stories. This suggests he found himself in lots of different occasions in which people were graphically killed suddenly, and that these kinds of experiences often happened, so they no longer seemed to be very shocking to the soldier. This is why he speaks in a conversational and almost chatty tone, because it had become an everyday occurrence and general topic of conversation. Armitage is therefore demonstrating that witnessing death becomes normal to soldiers during times of war, and its significance is gradually diminished until it becomes trivial. Okay, so these are good examples of SQI. Hopefully by now in front of you, you have one that you have also written yourself, so well done. Congratulations. I am going to be asking you to submit either as a photo or typed up and submitted on Show My Homework that SQI about Remains, but I am also going to ask you to do a new task where you write another SQI about a new poem. This is a poem we did look at a couple of weeks ago. It's Exposure by Wilfred Owen, and I'm going to ask you to follow exactly the same steps to write your statement, then your quote, and then your inference about one thing that Wilfred Owen is showing us in relation to a theme that his poem Exposure explores. So I've got some helpful information to help you along with this task. Some of the main themes the poem Exposure is used to explore are the reality of conflict, the effects of war on the soldiers, the power of nature, sort of against man in this case, and the power or lack of power that man has, okay? So you can pick one of those themes to write your SQI about and talk about one thing that Wilfred Owen is showing us about that theme. Some of the main quotes from the poem are here as well. These were included in the video that I asked you, I or your teachers asked you to watch a couple of weeks ago. So our brains ache, bullets less deathly than the air that shudders black. The love of God seems dying, but nothing happens, and on us the doors are closed. So maybe have a look back at your notes on these quotes to work out what it is that Owen might be hinting at and suggesting about one of the themes on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to pause there and have a go at doing this. However, if you're looking for a bit of a challenge, okay, if you think SQI, done that, know it, excellent, and you're looking for a bit of an extension, then have a look at the next two slides that I'm just about to show you. You can always rewind and pause for an extra challenge. So if you're looking for extra challenge, there are other things you can add to your analytical paragraphs: connotations, effects, further effects, and development. You can pause on that, have a read through, have a go, raise the challenge, and have a go at including those after you've done your SQI. I've included a waggle for you, which is just my SQI from earlier in the video, and then how I've added on the connotation, and then the detailed effect, and then the development. So you can have a read through that to see how do you extend and do a more successful and detailed analytical paragraph using those things. But the main thing that I'm asking you to do is to now write SQI, statement, then quote, then inference, about one thing Wilfred Owen is showing us through his poem Exposure. So pause the video to have this slide in front of you if you need to, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do before going back to show my homework and uploading the 2 SQI paragraphs you have written today. Brilliant. Well done, guys. Thank you very much. Well done for all your hard work. And we can't wait to see what you come up with to give you feedback. All right. Thanks very much.